And today we are going to cover what is aphasia, the definitions of aphasia, what it's like to experience aphasia, and some of the different types. We'll also talk about what is not aphasia, so some speech and cognitive disorders. And then we'll spend some time on how to speak aphasia, so tips for getting your message in and for helping someone with aphasia get their message out, and some common mistakes that cause communication breakdowns. So, who am I? My name is Megan Sutton. I am a speech-language pathologist. I earned my Master of Science degree in speech-language pathology from Boston University, and I have 15 years of experience as a speech pathologist in hospitals, rehab centers, community, and private practice. I am also a speech therapy app developer. My company is called Tactus Therapy Solutions, and that's our website for speech therapy apps that people can use at home, mostly for aphasia. I am also co-author of a book about stroke recovery called Healing the Broken Brain, Leading Experts Answer 100 Questions About Stroke Recovery. And this is a book that is intended for families dealing with stroke and for stroke survivors themselves. I also do a lot of speaking and education for speech pathologists about how to use technology in aphasia therapy. So most people with aphasia have learned to speak, read, and write normally, and then they acquire this language impairment. And language is the words that you use to communicate. And we'll talk more about what language is as opposed to speech a bit later. Now, the most common brain injury to cause aphasia is a stroke. And the stroke is usually on the left side of the brain. So you'll see people who have right-sided paralysis because the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And the left side of the brain also controls language in about 96% of people. So it's usually a stroke that causes aphasia, but we do know that aphasia can be caused by traumatic brain injury, a brain tumor, or an infection. And when you have aphasia, it can affect your ability to speak, understand, read, or write, and often to varying degrees. So someone might have a lot of trouble speaking, but understands fairly well. Some people might be able to read, but they can't write, or vice versa. But it's important to note that aphasia does not affect intelligence or competence. So you can visit the Tactus Therapy website for more information on what is aphasia and how to help somebody with aphasia. But this is kind of the overview of the technical definition. The real definition, and I say real meaning the reality of what it is to have aphasia, is that aphasia is a communication impairment that impacts identity and relationships because of difficulties speaking, understanding, reading, and writing. So the identity and relationships part is what's left out of the medical definition, but this is the reality of the situation. And this is a longer view of how aphasia disrupts identity and relationships. So aphasia disrupts communication, the core of our ability to develop and maintain relationships, take part in home and community events, and project a public image of who we are. So without the ability to participate in conversation, every relationship, every life role, and almost every life activity is at huge risk. This results not only in barriers to accessing healthcare services and information, but also inevitably leads to a loss of self-esteem and a profound sense of social isolation. And this comes from a recent white paper called Aphasia in North America that has a lot of statistics and facts about aphasia that people can use to help advocate for aphasia services. So let's do a little thought experiment here. I want you to think of the last thing you said aloud. And go ahead, say it aloud again. The last thing you said before coming on here. Now imagine That's the last thing you'll ever say. But you're not going to die, so that's good news. You're going to go on living for years, but without saying another meaningful word. So the people you meet won't get to hear about the things you've accomplished, the places you've been, or your thoughts on the latest news. You won't get to recommend a show that you just watched or brag about your kids. The people who love you will still know who you are, and if you're lucky, they'll stand by your side. But a lot of people will fade away from your life, not because they didn't like you, but because it's really hard to be friends with someone who doesn't talk much, and they just don't know what to do. How does that feel? Okay, let's try another thought experiment. Now, you have been dropped into a foreign country where you do not speak a word of the language. You cannot understand people, you cannot read the signs, and nobody understands you. But you're still you. You're still smart, competent, and skilled, but you simply cannot communicate, and you cannot go home. How does that feel? That's almost like having aphasia, except add to that now that you also can't use your right arm, you can't walk. People are shouting at you even though your hearing is fine. Some people talk to you like you're a baby, and others talk about you like you're not even there. But most shockingly is you aren't in a foreign country, you're in your own town, and you still might not be able to go back home. This is the reality for a lot of stroke survivors with aphasia. Okay, I'm going to give just a quick note about the terminology because you might hear the word dysphasia. And so let's look at the roots of the word. So the Greek prefixes, a before a word means no, without, or not. So like atypical means not typical. And aphasia means no language or without language. Whereas the Greek prefix dys, dys, means bad or difficult. So dyslexia is difficulty with reading, and dysphasia is difficulty with language. And most people who have aphasia actually have dysphasia. They have difficulty with language, not no language at all. However, there's another condition called dysphagia, which is difficulty swallowing. And dysphagia and dysphasia sound way too similar. And they're both part of the speech language pathologist's work. And this would get very, very confusing. So whether it's dysphagia with a G or dysphagia with an S, we're just not going to talk about difficulty with language. We're going to use the word aphasia. And there's been a global consensus on this that we're going to call everyone who has difficulty with language, say that they have aphasia, because that one term can unify people. It gives them a word that they can Google and look up and find resources. So we're going to talk about aphasia today. There are lots of different types of aphasia that you might hear. Some of the names are based on the location in the brain, like Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, global aphasia, and all these others. And the model that speech pathologists use in diagnosing these types of aphasias are based on how fluent someone is, how well they understand, and how well they repeat. And those were originally based on the different areas of the brain. So we have an area of the brain called Broca's area, and damage there was thought to cause Broca's aphasia. Another area of the brain called Wernicke's area that would cause Wernicke's aphasia. But we actually, the more we learn about the brain, we know that this isn't exactly right. That a stroke anywhere in this pink area could cause aphasia. This is the distribution of the middle cerebral artery. So now we talk more about types of aphasia that are based on, pardon me, that some people were using terms based on the most impaired modality. So you would hear somebody have expressive aphasia or receptive aphasia. Okay, so some people would use the terms expressive aphasia or receptive aphasia, but these are very misleading terms because somebody who has expressive aphasia probably also has some trouble understanding, and people with receptive aphasia also have problems with their speech. So a lot of times now we'll use the type of aphasia based on how easy it is for somebody to produce words. So we have non-fluent aphasia and fluent aphasia. This isn't a perfect system either because severity plays a big role. And we just have to remember that every aphasia is unique because every brain is different, every stroke is different, and every person is different. So we just use these terms to sort of get a general idea of what might be happening or what we might expect with someone's speech. So let's start with non-fluent aphasia. This might also be called Broca's aphasia or expressive aphasia. And this is when somebody has very effortful telegraphic speech. And it's called telegraphic speech because back when people used telegrams and they would pay by the word, they would leave out all of those little words that weren't worth paying for. So somebody with non-fluent aphasia might have speech that's like, they might just say hungry instead of I'm hungry. And usually these people are better at understanding than they are at talking. And often you'll see that they have a paralyzed right hand. So I'm going to show you a video of somebody with non-fluent aphasia.
Seven sales and worldwide, and very good. Yeah.
Okay, and who are you looking at over there when you turn your head?
That's my wife.
Okay, and why is she helping you to talk?
She's a speech.
So you have trouble with your speech?
Yeah.
And what's that called?
Aphasia.
All right. And so why don't you work now?
I do.
And what do you do now?
Voices of Hope aphasia.
And what is Voices of Hope?
Peterburg, and Dr. Hinckley and myself, founder for me, and I members the members probably 60 people.
So 60 people are part of Voices of Hope,
Yes.
which is an aphasia support group
Yes.
that you founded.
Yes.
And Dr. Jackie Hinckley is part of that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
It's not a support group.
No,
It's
programs. It's 3 days. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and and they laugh and talked. Music here, it's just beautiful. It's, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, what does it feel like to have aphasia?
It's hard. It's well, speech that's like words that don't understand. Brain is good, you know, but it's speech like I don't know. It's like words. Yuck.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. So that was Mike, and that is a common type of aphasia. You could hear his telegraphic speech, how effortful it was. He wasn't a fluent speaker. Now there is another kind of aphasia, the fluent type, and we probably see this a little bit less in stroke groups, perhaps because there is usually no physical paralysis. So people don't have the same physical disabilities from stroke because the stroke lesion site is a bit further back in the brain, so it doesn't affect the motor function as much. And this is called Wernicke's aphasia or receptive aphasia. And these people have very effortless speech, but there's very little meaning in it, and they have a lot of trouble understanding. There's more information about both of these aphasia types at the link, but right now I'm going to show you a video of Mr. Byron Peterson. Let's try to get out of here. Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talk with the people, with them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
June.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
The iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was fairly good and happy when I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talking any more to say?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Okay. Let me get my headset back in. Sorry about the sound glitch there.
Okay, so that was fluent aphasia. There were a lot of words. They came out very effortlessly, but they didn't make a lot of sense. I knew a little bit about what he was saying. Let me just make sure my audio is working here. Yep, okay. But for the most part, he repeated a lot of the same words, and they weren't the words that he really meant to say. And then there's another type of aphasia called global aphasia. And this is a very severe aphasia where speaking, understanding, reading, and writing are all very severely impaired. People with global aphasia can still understand some personal information, but they will often have some sort of stereotypical utterance that they repeat. So it could be a word, it could be a phrase, it could be a series of syllables, nonsense syllables, that don't mean anything. So there was a question in the chat of what if they just keep repeating constantly and only say, I want to everything. So without knowing this person, it sounds to me like they might have global aphasia, where their stereotypical utterance happens to be, I want to, 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 I want to. And that doesn't mean I want to. That just happens to be a phrase that got stuck on repeat, and that's all that they have access to. So a lot of people with aphasia who have this stereotypical utterance will say those words, and then someone will say, you want to what? What do you want to do? What is it? And they're trying to figure it out. But the thing is, it's not about I want to at all. It's just an attempt to communicate. So in that case, you want to listen to the tone. If somebody says, I want to, that's, I'm happy to see you. If they say, I want to, means probably I don't want to, or go away, leave me alone. So it's important to listen to how they say it and to not get hung up on the words. I've worked with people who say, you can come, you can come, you can come. Had a woman that I worked with who just said Ollie all the time. Ollie, 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 Ollie. But you could tell what she meant as she repeated that word. Not all the time, but a little bit of it. Swearing is also fairly common and unintentional in people with global aphasia. So they might not be able to say anything else, but those four-letter words just come out clear as day. There are some unique features of aphasia that it's important to be aware of. So something called paraphasias, and these are words that come out that are wrong. They're not the word the person means, but they're a mistake. And some of those are sound-based and some are meaning-based. So a sound-based error, actually this should be forest. Maybe somebody says forest instead of fork. So they've got some of the sounds right, but they're using the wrong word. Now, of course, if they're sitting down and looking at a plate of food and they ask you for a forest, it's a good guess that they don't actually want a bunch of trees. They want a fork. They might ask for a spoon when they want a fork, because that's a meaning-based error or a semantic error. Or they might use a word that doesn't exist at all. We just talked about stereotypes with if it's not global aphasia, if they say but there tends to be a phrase that comes out more commonly than others, it could be a perseveration. So perseveration is when a word gets stuck in a person's speech. They often know it's not right, but they can't stop themselves from saying it. So if you meet somebody and you say, hi, my name is Megan, and they say Megan, and then they try to tell you their name, they might just say Megan again. It just gets stuck. So often it's good to just take a break, reset. Sometimes I'll have people, just count a little bit, get some different sounds in coming out of their mouth, and then they might be able to get the right word out. Another unique feature of aphasia is the empty speech. And we heard a lot of this from Byron in the video. So he said a lot, but he actually didn't say very much. Some people who have trouble with word finding will also do this. So they might say something like, the thing was in the place, but it didn't do it. And you know that that's an English sentence, but you have no idea what they were talking about because they're using a lot of filler words like thing and place and it. There's also automatic speech, which is stuff that's overlearned, like counting or the days of the week, familiar songs. So you might run into somebody who can't say very much at all, but they can count to 10. Or they can't put together a sentence, but they can sing happy birthday. And you also saw in the video of Byron, at the end, he said, "Have a good day." Clear as a bell. And so that is sort of an overlearned sentence. That's automatic speech. He just says that to people when he leaves. And that's stored in a different part of the brain. We are a bit about swearing. It is often intentional. People who never want to swear in front of you might be swearing at the storm. They might be very embarrassed about this. Of course, who's really is embarrassed, but it communicates their emotional reaction. And we also need to be aware with people with aphasia that there are some parts of speech that are especially difficult. Yes and no seem like really easy words, but they can be easy to mix up for people with aphasia. So you always want to double check if they actually meant yes or actually meant no. Numbers can be very tricky. So if we're telling somebody a time or a date that we need them to remember, it's usually best to write that down because understanding numbers is hard and communicating numbers is also hard. And pronouns are tricky. Things like he, she, his, her. People with aphasia often get the gender wrong. So they might be talking about their wife and say he. Now, some people might go into, a bit of a mental spin and say, oh, is this somebody who has, a different orientation? But it could just be that they've mixed up the pronouns. So don't assume that they've got that right. Just go with the idea of, oh, they're talking about a person. I think we were talking about the wife. Okay. And verify that. Okay, let's end with a few facts about aphasia in this section. We know that, actually we don't know how many stroke patients have aphasia because estimates are all over the place. Some studies show 24%, some show as high as 50%. But a lot of that aphasia that people have right after their stroke does get better. Some of it resolves completely. Some people go on to live with aphasia chronically for the rest of their lives. Current estimates suspect that 2.5 million Americans and about 166,000 Canadians are living with aphasia. And this is nearly twice as many people as there are people with Parkinson's disease. But everybody's heard about Parkinson's, and yet the general public knows very little or nothing about aphasia. So there have been a lot of efforts to increase aphasia awareness, and that is working because 30% of the population, roughly, has heard the word aphasia. That means 70% of the population has not even heard the word. But just hearing the word isn't enough because when you ask them, oh, well, what is aphasia? People answer, oh, I think it's a skin disorder, or it's a drug people take. They just don't know what it is. And if you don't know what it is, you can't sympathize with someone who has it and you can't help them. So we now know what aphasia is. It's a communication disorder that impacts identity and relationships, and it's an acquired language disorder from a brain injury. So what isn't aphasia? Well, there are 3 types of communication disorders that we commonly see after stroke. Language disorders like aphasia, speech disorders, dysarthria, stuttering, or voice problems, and cognitive communication disorders. So language, a language disorder is a problem with language. Language is stored in the brain and it is shared culturally. So you grow up perhaps speaking English. That is part of your culture. You learn it from your parents. As a baby, you could just as easily learn Spanish or French or Chinese or Punjabi. Your brain is able to pick up the language of your culture. And that includes talking that language, listening and understanding that language. When you go to school, you learn to write that language and you learn to read it as well. So speech is the most common way that we transmit language. So speech is the actual physical sounds that we make. And to speak, you have to breathe, your vocal cords have to vibrate, you have to shape your mouth with your lips and your tongue in a certain way so that the right sound comes out. And then you can vary how fast you talk, how much emphasis you put on words, and the melodic flow of your speech. So is aphasia a speech disorder? No. Speech is physical, language is cognitive. But of course, some people have both speech and language disorders. The most common speech problem that we see after stroke is called dysarthria, and that is slurred or distorted speech. And this is usually because the paralysis has hit their face and their tongue and lips are weak or poorly coordinated. The sounds may be extra nasal because they're not able to stop the airflow from coming through their nose. And this may sound like somebody's been drinking too much or had Novocaine, had some dental numbing, and they can't really talk very clearly because their tongue, they don't have the sensation or the movement. So you know that it's dysarthria, you know it's a speech problem if all the words are there, but they're just not pronounced clearly. And you know it's aphasia, or a language problem, if the speech is clear, but the words don't make sense or there aren't many words. And some people get aphasia and dysarthria, so they don't have too many words or their words don't make sense and they're slurred. Now, it's important to know this so that if you are putting together an aphasia group in your stroke group, somebody with dysarthria isn't going to need the same supports as someone with aphasia. If you start writing down important words for someone with dysarthria, they're going to look at you like you're a little crazy because they understand the language just fine. They just have trouble producing their speech. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on apraxia because it's really confusing, because apraxia often co-occurs with aphasia, but it is a speech problem that comes from difficulty planning the muscle movements. So their muscles work fine. It's not about weakness. They just have trouble controlling them. So they might have really slow or halting speech that has a very staccato rhythm. They might be able to say one thing really easily and then not be able to say it again. And some people with severe apraxia can't talk at all. They might be able to laugh or cough or grunt, but they can't form words. Another type of communication disorder is a cognitive communication disorder. And this usually happens to people who have strokes that affect the right hemisphere of their brain. So these will be the people who have the left-sided paralysis. And in the right side of the brain, there'll be more damage to things like attention or memory, judgment, reasoning abilities, problem-solving abilities. So they might process things really slowly. They might show lapses in judgment. Some people with right hemisphere disorders can be socially inappropriate and say things that make you cringe a little bit. And there's a lot more information at this new website, righthemisphere.org, on what it's like to have a cognitive communication disorder. And these can be very challenging for families because it's almost a personality change in their loved one, and they don't really know how to deal with it. So it does affect the way that they communicate, but it's not aphasia. So let's get back to aphasia and talk a little bit about how to speak aphasia. And these are some tips for how to presume and reveal a person's competence, because as we said, aphasia is not an impairment of intelligence or competence. So we have to start off presuming that that person with aphasia is completely competent. And once we presume that, it's our job to reveal that to others. So we need to help get our message in so that they can understand it, help them get their message out so that we know what they want to say and what they're thinking, and verify that everything they've understood is correct and everything that we've understood from them is correct. There are a lot of tips and tricks for doing this. It's called supported conversation for aphasia, and that's an entirely different webinar, but I'm going to give you just the basics of things that you can do the next time you're with your stroke survivors. I'm not going to read through all of these tips for presuming competence, but I do want to highlight a few of them. I'm going to show you a couple of slides with these tips, and I think it's really interesting that all of these tips come from a book about people with autism. There are a lot of parallels between people with autism and people with aphasia, because they both have trouble with language, and they both have trouble with how people treat them because of that difference. But I find these to be all very true for people with aphasia. So you want to ask before giving assistance, treat adults as adults, use a typical tone of voice, speak directly to the person, not to their support person or companion, and never assume that a person who has limited or no speech cannot understand, because most people do understand more than they can say. This one is so important. Never pretend you understand what is said when you don't. That's just rude. You think you're doing a nice thing, smiling and nodding and moving on, but that person believes that you have understood their message. And if you go off and they're expecting you to act on that message, they're going to be quite disappointed. So it's okay to ask them to tell you again. Repeat back what you understand. And if you really don't understand what they've said, say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that right now. Maybe we can come back to it. Don't try to finish a person's sentence or cut them off. Now, some people with aphasia don't mind if you suggest the word that you think they're trying to say, and others do. So it's always best to ask. Just say, hey, when you're struggling for a word, would you like me to suggest it for you or not? Because often what will happen is you'll suggest a word, but it's not the right word, so you'll suggest another one and another one and another one. And if you had just given them a few extra seconds, they would have provided the correct word on their own. So that can be frustrating. You want to avoid speaking for others. Encourage people with aphasia to make their own decisions. Don't make decisions for them. This is a key one. Because some people like to please others, it's important to watch your body language, tone of voice, and other gestures that may influence a person's decision. So you might be saying, oh, you'd like some ice cream, wouldn't you? As you smile and nod. And they want you to be happy, so they smile and nod too. So ask things in a neutral tone of voice. And then the person's actually making their own decisions. And of course, in our groups, we always want to find ways to include a person with aphasia in a conversation and not talk about them like they're not there. Okay. Now here's a few tips to help you get your message in. So we want to start with the environment. Minimize distractions. So if there's any sort of loud TV or radio on, you want to turn that off. If you need to have an important conversation, find a quiet place or just pull them aside away from other people. I know in our groups it's very hard to find a quiet place. And you want to limit conversations to as few people as possible at a time. In a large group, a person with aphasia is going to have trouble participating. So the smaller the group, the better. You need to simplify your language by speaking in short and uncomplicated sentences. Establish the topic or let the person know when it changes. So if we're talking about what we did for dinner, what we had for dinner last night, we're talking about food, and then suddenly it's like, oh, well, what are you going to do this weekend? It's good to let the person with aphasia know a bit more explicitly. Oh, we're not talking about dinner anymore. Now we're talking about the weekend. Because those quick topic changes can be hard to keep up with. And any important words that you say, you might want to repeat or write down as keywords. Of course, you'll use facial expressions, gestures, and pointing to help clarify your message so that it's not just words, but there's a lot of nonverbal cues to help somebody understand. And you should speak slowly and naturally without raising your voice or talking down. So this goes back to the no shouting and no talking to somebody like they're a baby. Now, to help somebody get their message out, it can help to ask simple yes/no questions. Make sure you're not asking double negatives, but very clear, short yes/no questions. And when you ask a yes or no question and you're expecting a yes or no answer, you might get something in between that's not really a clear answer. And that might be maybe, it might be I don't know, it might be I don't care, or it could be I don't understand what you're asking. So always in the back of your mind, have that those are possibilities when you're not getting a really clear yes or no. It can help if you provide 2 or 3 choices in your questions and write down those choices so that somebody can point to the choice that they want. Sometimes if I give 2 choices, I'll indicate that one choice is my right hand and one choice is my left hand so that they can point to the hand of the option that they wanted. And you can also help by providing answer examples if there are lots of possibilities, so that the person with aphasia knows the type of answer you expect. So you might say, how would you like your coffee? With cream, sugar, black? They can give an, they might be able to say cream and sugar, but at least they know the type of answer you're looking for, not hot or cold. So there's a question about yes/no questions. It can be hard to say yes or no for a person with aphasia. So would you then just look at their body language? That's a great question. Yes, it can be, you would look at their body language. Some people will nod their head and smile while the word no comes out of their mouth. And others will shake their head side to side and say the word yes. Usually it's the head that's telling the truth, not the word. So that's when you might take a piece of paper, write down yes with a check mark or a smiley face, and write down no with an X or a sad face, and ask them to point to their answer so that you can verify which they actually mean. Good question. If you're feeling really lost or you need to verify very important information and you're not sure that you got it right, always go back to a caregiver or family member if one is available so that you have the right information. And sometimes, they know the person so well that they can just give you a little clue as to what the conversation's about, and then you can take off on your own again. We also want to help people with aphasia to get their messages out. And we can do this by asking simple yes or no questions. Now, the answer might be yes, and it might be no, but we also have to allow that maybe the answer is maybe, or I don't know, or I don't care, or maybe I don't understand. So if you force them to pick yes or no, they might be giving the wrong answer if you don't consider that there's other possibilities. You can also provide 2 or 3 choices in your questions and write down those options so that people can point to it. Sometimes I will give 2 choices and designate a hand for each choice So, do you want chocolate or vanilla? And I'll say my left hand is chocolate, my right hand's vanilla, and then they can touch my hand for those choices if I don't have paper to write it down. You can also provide answer examples. So if there's lots of possibilities and you don't know, you can say things like, well, what do you want for dinner? Do you want Mexican, Thai, sushi? To just sort of give the type of answer that you're expecting. You also want to allow the person extra time to respond. So be very patient and don't feel like you have to fill that time with choices or rephrasing. Just allow for some time for them to answer. And encourage any type of communication. Speech is great, but also accept gesture, writing, pointing, or drawing, and encourage those forms of response. Provide paper or ask if it would help to write things down. Sometimes people won't have pen and paper on their own, but as soon as you provide it, they're more than happy to use it. And you want to avoid correcting the person's speech. Conversation is not therapy. So if they say a word slightly wrong, but you understand it, you can repeat it, but don't require them to say it correctly. To help get their message out, you can also enlist the help of a caregiver or family member if you're feeling really lost or you need to verify very important information. You don't want to ignore that the person with aphasia is there and trying, but just ask if it's okay to check or involve the other person in the conversation. And summarize what you've understood as you go. That helps you from getting too far off track if you're not understanding correctly. It's perfectly fine to admit when you don't understand and agree to return to an idea later if you just can't get to it. I usually give people a choice to say, is this really important and we should keep going? Or is this something we can come back to another time? And then if you do say you're going to come back to it later, please do. Make a note of it, write it down so that you can bring it up later. And encourage the person with aphasia to rest when he or she is tired. Communication is much harder when you're tired. So it may not be a good time to talk about something when the person is tired. So providing the person with pen and paper or dry erase board is really good. You can use it as well. You can both use it. And it always helps when you're using the same tools to communicate. If you use speech, the person with aphasia is going to want to use speech. But if you use writing, the person with aphasia is more likely to use writing because it seems more normal. You can use an alphabet board or a picture board if they have one. Sometimes an alphabet board will help jog memory or help with spelling, and picture boards are good for basic needs or specific topics. And I love using technology to help someone get their message out, bringing up Google Maps, or if somebody tells me a word, like the name of a book or movie, and I've never heard of it, I'll look it up, and then we can learn more about it. And that often brings up photos and information that can facilitate the conversation. And a lot of people with aphasia use their photos to communicate. They will bring up their photo reel and show you some things that they did or people in their family. So here is our communication toolbox. Yes, no questions, paper, pencil, gesturing, writing, talking, and we're adding technology to this toolbox. Now, here are some common mistakes that people make when speaking with someone with aphasia. The first is assuming that they understand more than they do because they nod and look at you intently while you're speaking. So they are using the nonverbal cues you're giving off with your own body language, your own facial expressions and tone of voice. They may not be understanding all of your words, but they're acting like they understand because they don't want to stop you from your normal communication. So try to notice, are all of your questions being answered with a consistent yes or no? So if you say, oh, do you want to do this? The expected answer is yes. Oh, have you done this before? Do they say yes again? Are they always answering yes? That might be a clue that they're not understanding. So you might vary the response that's expected. Context is important. So if you are talking about something that is right in front of you and it makes sense, they might understand what the topic is about, but not all the intricacies of that conversation. So think about when you learn a new language. You can understand more than you can say, but you often don't get every word, especially if someone is speaking fast or you don't know exactly what the conversation's about. So you pick up the words that you know and you try to piece the meaning together, assuming some sort of logic to the conversation. Sometimes that works, but sometimes it doesn't. When you're speaking with someone with aphasia, beware of speaking too loudly or too slowly. So most people with aphasia have not lost their hearing, unless they do have a hearing impairment. So saying something louder or much slower will not help them understand. Instead, say it simply, say it clearly, and write down the key words. You could probably hear when I started speaking slowly, it sounded distorted. We don't speak that way. So keep it normal, but clear and simple. Also, don't speak too much or in complicated sentences. So for example, you could say, "You don't want me to get you a napkin, do you?" Or, "Would you like a napkin?" Obviously, the second one is a lot easier to understand. And finally, an error that people make is taking people with aphasia's words too literally. Often people with aphasia struggle to come out with a word, but often they'll come out with the wrong word. So if you get really stuck on the exact word that they've said, it may not be the word that they mean. So try to listen for the meaning behind the words. And repeat it back to see if that's actually what they meant. They may not recognize that they made an error, but they might recognize it when you make the error. So if you think you may have gone down a dead end, back up to the last thing you know was right. So if you're asking yes or no questions, is this about your daughter? Yes. Is she getting married? Yes. Are you going to the wedding? Yes. And then suddenly you get to a no, you're like, wait a minute, okay, your daughter is getting married, right? This is about your daughter, right? You can back up to make sure that you got the answer right. And a few final points. Treat the person with aphasia how you would want to be treated, with patience and respect. Expect them to think logically. Presume that they are competent. Follow their logic and their attempts to communicate. Use simple yes or no questions to narrow down the intent, the topic, and the specifics. And get to know the person with aphasia and include them in conversation as much as possible to relieve social isolation. And you can do all of this by using the communication tools available to you. Don't limit you or the person with aphasia to only using speech. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this webinar and to learn about communicating with people with aphasia. Now I hope you have a better idea of what aphasia is and what it isn't, and you can help reduce the isolation for people with aphasia by improving your understanding of what they're going through and how to communicate with them. These handouts will be made available to you, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me at megan@tactistherapy.com. Thanks so much.